Snow clung to the ruins like a shroud, softening the jagged edges of broken homes, yet doing nothing to silence the memory of fire. The village church, once the proud heart of the community, stood hollow, its bell cracked on the ground, buried in white. Winter in Western Germany was cruel that year, not just in its temperature but in its indifference. The world seemed intent on forgetting the people left behind, especially the children. Liesel Engel pressed her back against the splintered wood of the barn door, her breath visible in the air. At 13, she had grown far too old for her age. Her blonde hair, once neatly braided by her mother's hands, now fell in a tangled curtain around her pale face. Beneath the oversized coat she had stolen from a deserted house, her body was thin, her stomach hollow with hunger. The only warmth she clung to was the responsibility of the children who looked to her for guidance. Inside the barn, 7 pairs of eyes reflected the faint light of a lantern. Maximilian coughed weakly, his lips trembling as he tried to hide his shivers under a threadbare blanket. Greta sat beside him, holding his hand, her own face drawn with fear but firm in its resolve. Emil rocked back and forth near the haystack, humming quietly, pretending not to notice how thin the hay had become. They had not eaten for 2 days. The potato sack was empty. Even melted snow, once a relief, now tasted like ash in their mouths. Liesel had promised she would find something, but promises carried little weight when stomachs groaned louder than words. She remembered her mother's lullaby, sung on the night bombs fell over their home. It had been meant to soothe her, but the sound of explosions had drowned out every note. That memory cut through her heart like a shard of glass. She pushed it down, forcing herself to focus on the present, because grief was a luxury. Survival was all they had left. Outside, the wind screamed across the ruined fields, dragging with it the echo of a world in collapse. Each gust rattled the barn door, and with every creak the children's eyes darted to her. Liesel straightened her shoulders, trying to appear stronger than she felt. "We'll find food tomorrow," she whispered, her voice firm though her throat tightened. "I promise." Greta's gaze met hers, skeptical but not dismissive. "Tomorrow again, Liesel. What if there is no food left?" Emil's laugh was hollow. "Maybe the Americans will drop bread from the sky." "Stop," Liesel snapped, too sharply, then softened. "Don't say things like that. We don't wait for miracles. We survive." Her words settled heavily in the silence. The truth was she didn't know how much longer they could. She tucked Maximilian's blanket tighter around him, brushing his damp forehead with her hand. Fever. Another problem she couldn't solve. The barn creaked again. This time it wasn't just the wind. Somewhere beyond the fields, distant footsteps crunched in the snow. Her heart skipped. She held her breath, listening. The children stiffened. Silence fell, broken only by Maximilian's cough. Then nothing, just the wind again. She let out the air she'd been holding, forcing calm into her expression. "It's nothing, just the wind." But she wasn't sure. Night stretched long and merciless. Liesel stayed awake, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the barn door. Hunger clawed her insides, and fear pressed against her chest, but she refused to surrender to either. The children needed her. She would not let them see her falter. The snow kept falling, thick and heavy, as though the world itself wanted to bury them under its cold silence. Yet somewhere deep inside, she clung to the fragile hope that dawn might bring change, not in the form of miracles, but perhaps in something as simple as warmth, or bread, or a kind face. And before we go deeper into Liesel's journey of strength, survival, and unexpected hope, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories from history. Tomorrow would test them again. And tomorrow, Liesel knew, she would have to face the cold with nothing but courage. Morning came reluctantly, its light dimmed by heavy clouds that smothered the sky. The barn smelled of damp straw and ash, and the children stirred one by one, blinking at the pale grey that seeped through the cracks in the walls. Liesel had not slept. She had kept her place near the door, her ears tuned to every shift of the wind, her body stiff with both exhaustion and resolve. She rose quietly, pulling her coat tighter around her thin frame. Her stomach ached with emptiness, but she pushed the sensation down, knowing it was no worse than what the younger ones felt. Maximilian's cough was harsher this morning, rattling in his chest like stones in a tin can. Greta held his hand, whispering to him, though her eyes lifted to Liesel with a silent plea. "I'll find something," Liesel said, her voice steady, though her throat was dry. Greta frowned. "You said that last night. You always say it." "I mean it today," Liesel replied, sharper than she intended. She regretted the edge in her tone, but she couldn't soften. Not when everyone's survival weighed on her. Emil, crouched in the corner with his knees pulled tight to his chest, gave a crooked smile. "Maybe you'll bring back roast goose, eh?" His attempt at humor was hollow, but it drew a faint laugh from two of the younger children. For a moment their eyes brightened, and that moment was enough to remind Liesel why she couldn't give up. She crouched near him. "If I find even a crust of bread, it will be better than goose," she said, forcing warmth into her voice. Emil shrugged, still trying to mask the worry beneath his playful words. The barn door groaned as she pushed it open, and the cold bit at her face instantly. Outside, the world was a sheet of white, broken only by the black skeletons of burned houses in the distance. The village lay silent, its streets buried under snow and memory. She paused, listening again for footsteps, for any sound that didn't belong. Only the moan of the wind greeted her. She stepped into the snow, her boots sinking deep. Behind her, Greta's voice called softly, "Be careful." The words followed her as she walked toward the ruins. The silence was oppressive. Every shuttered window seemed like an eye watching her. Once, this village had been full of voices, of bread baking in ovens, of children running freely in the square. Now it was a hollow shell, each building carrying the scars of fire and shelling. She entered what had once been the bakery. The roof was half collapsed, the air heavy with soot. She rummaged through the wreckage, her fingers numb as she overturned charred wood and broken shelves. Nothing, not a crumb, not even a hardened piece of dough. Her heart sank, but she kept moving. She went house to house, careful not to linger too long. Most were stripped bare, the cupboards raided, the cellars emptied. In one she found a cracked mug with a frozen layer of water. She scraped it with her fingernail, collecting shards of ice into her coat pocket. It wasn't food, but it was something. At the far end of the street she spotted Herr Dietrich. The old man leaned against his doorframe, his figure thin but upright, his face stern. He had survived while others hadn't, though no one quite knew how. Liesel hesitated before approaching. She needed help, and he was the only adult left in sight. "Herr Dietrich," she called softly, her voice carrying in the brittle air. "Do you have anything to spare? The children—" His hand shot up to silence her. "You think I have more than you?" His voice was rough, his eyes sharp. "My cupboard is as empty as yours." She took a step closer, desperation breaking through her caution. "Just a little. Anything. One of them is sick." He glared at her, then turned back inside, shutting the door with a finality that struck like a blow. The cold pressed harder against her then, heavier than the snow. She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. There was no help coming, not from him, not from anyone. When she returned to the barn, the children's eyes turned to her at once, searching her hands, her pockets, her face. She gave Greta the shards of ice and shook her head. That night, the silence was heavier than the cold, and though Liesel did not say it aloud, she knew the truth. Her promises were running out. The frost crept deeper with each passing day, clawing its way into the barn until it felt as though the walls themselves were made of ice. The children huddled together beneath thin layers of straw and cloth, but the cold pierced every barrier, biting into their bones. Liesel sat upright through much of the night, rubbing Maximilian's back as his cough shook his frail body. The sound was relentless, echoing in the barn like a reminder of how fragile their lives had become. By morning, even Emil's humor had lost its edge. He sat with his arms around his knees, staring blankly at the floor. "It feels colder than yesterday," he murmured. "It always feels colder when you're hungry," Greta replied. Her tone carried no malice, only weary truth. She glanced toward Liesel, her lips pressed thin. We can't stay like this, not forever. Liesel didn't respond immediately. She rose, brushing the frost from her sleeves, and walked to the barn door. Beyond it, the village lay under a blanket of white, deceptively peaceful. But she knew what peace looked like, and this wasn't it. This was absence, of food, of laughter, of life. When she returned inside, Greta was waiting with arms crossed. We should go east. There might be food there, maybe other families. East? Emil's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Toward the fighting? That's madness. At least it's not here, Greta countered, her voice sharp. If we stay, we'll freeze or starve. Do you want Maximilian to die in this barn? Liesel's heart clenched. She looked at the boy curled in his blanket, his small chest rising unevenly. Greta's words were cruel, but not untrue. I'll find something, Liesel said firmly. We don't leave. Not yet. Greta's eyes flashed. You keep saying that, but every time you come back empty-handed. How much longer do we wait for your promises? The words stung, but Liesel held her ground. She couldn't let them see doubt. If she faltered, the fragile thread holding them together would snap. Later, when the others had dozed in uneasy sleep, Emil edged closer to her. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. She doesn't mean it, you know. Greta, she's just scared. So am I, Liesel admitted softly. He studied her face. You don't look it. That's the point, she whispered. The day dragged on, marked only by hunger and the gnawing chill. In the afternoon, Liesel ventured again into the village, though her body protested with every step. She passed houses stripped bare, their windows like empty eyes. In one yard, she found a chicken coop collapsed under snow. She dug through the drift, her hands raw, hoping against hope. But there were no eggs, no feathers, nothing alive, only splintered wood and ice. By the time she returned, her fingers were stiff, nearly useless. She curled them against her chest, willing warmth back into them. Inside, Greta sat by Maximilian, humming softly, though her eyes were red. Did you find anything? She asked. Liesel shook her head. The disappointment that settled over the group was heavier than words. The barn filled with silence again, broken only by Maximilian's cough and the occasional groan of the timbers in the wind. That night, as the temperature dropped even further, Liesel lay awake, staring at the rafters above. Every breath felt sharp, cutting at her lungs. She wanted to believe Greta was wrong, that hope still lived here in this broken village, but the frost whispered otherwise. When Maximilian stirred beside her, clutching her sleeve, she bent close. His voice was weak, barely more than a breath. Liesel, I'm cold. She kissed his forehead, her lips burning against his fevered skin. I know, she murmured. Hold on. Just a little longer. The frost outside thickened, spreading its white grip over the land. Inside, it settled in their bones, merciless and patient, waiting for the moment when even courage might not be enough. The barn had grown so silent that even the creak of the roof beams sounded like a threat. The children lay huddled together, each one wrapped in what scraps of cloth they could find, their breathing uneven. Liesel remained awake, her ears straining beyond the walls, chasing every shift in the wind as if the night itself were plotting against them. Snow fell steadily outside, its muffled descent cloaking the ruins of the village in a deceptive calm. But calm was never to be trusted. It was always the stillness before something broke. Sometime after midnight, a sound sliced through the hush. Not the moan of the wind or the settling of wood, but the distinct crunch of boots on snow. Liesel froze, her body tightening as though the cold had suddenly become a vice. She sat upright, her breath shallow. Another crunch, then another. Steady, deliberate, moving closer. Greta stirred, blinking awake. What is it? She whispered. Liesel pressed a finger to her lips. The noise came again, unmistakable this time. Heavy footsteps, foreign to the patterns of the village. Emil pushed himself up, his face pale, even in the dim lantern light. Is it them? His voice cracked on the last word. He didn't have to say who. They all knew the fear that lingered in their imaginations, Patrols, deserters, looters, men who took more than food. The younger children whimpered, clutching at each other. Maximilian's cough broke the silence again, ragged and desperate, a sound impossible to hide. Liesel's heart clenched. She crawled to the barn door, every movement slow, cautious. Her hands trembled as she pressed her ear against the wood. The footsteps were clearer now, close enough to count the rhythm. More than one person, maybe 3, maybe more. She turned to the others, her voice barely audible. "Stay quiet. Don't move." Greta's eyes widened. "What if they come in?" Liesel swallowed hard. "Then, we don't let them." The words felt braver than she felt inside. The crunch of boots stopped suddenly just outside the barn. The children held their breath, the silence so complete that even the fire of their fear seemed loud. Then, a low murmur of voices, unfamiliar, muffled by the walls, but foreign. The language was harsh, clipped, nothing Liesel recognized. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Foreigners. That meant soldiers. But whose? She had heard stories of men in strange uniforms, speaking strange tongues sweeping through towns. Some said they brought food, others said they brought only ruin. The barn door rattled slightly, as though someone had brushed against it. Liesel pressed her back against the wood, her palms flat as if her small body could keep out whatever loomed beyond. Greta crept closer, her whisper fierce. "We can't fight them, Liesel. If it's soldiers—" "Be quiet," Liesel hissed, her voice trembling. The footsteps shifted again, circling the barn slowly, deliberately. Snow crunched under each step, the sound of hunters stalking prey. Emil clutched a piece of broken wood like a weapon, though his hands shook too violently to hold it steady. The voices outside rose briefly, laughter cutting through the night. The sound was jarring, almost cruel in its casualness. Liesel's mind raced. If they were Germans, why did she not understand them? If they were enemies, what did they want here, in a village already stripped of life? Minutes dragged like hours. The children stayed frozen, caught between breath and silence, waiting for the door to burst open. Instead, after a long pause, the footsteps began to fade, crunching away into the distance until only the wind remained. The release of silence was almost unbearable. Emil exhaled loudly, dropping his piece of wood with a clatter. Greta slapped a hand over her mouth to keep from sobbing. "They didn't come in," one of the younger children whispered, their voice shaking. Liesel leaned her forehead against the barn door, her body sagging with exhaustion and fear. Relief came, but it was fragile, uncertain. Whoever they were, they knew the barn was here, and the thought that they might return clung to her like the frost itself. She turned back to the children, her voice low but steady. "We have to be ready. Next time they won't just pass by." The barn fell silent again, but the memory of footsteps lingered, echoing through the night, a promise of something waiting beyond the snow. The morning after the footsteps, the barn felt heavier than ever. Every creak of the beams made the children flinch. Every gust of wind outside sent their eyes darting toward the door. Liesel barely closed her eyes all night, and when she did, she dreamed of boots stamping through snow and shadows breaking through the walls. By midday, hunger gnawed at them so fiercely that even Emil stopped trying to joke. He sat listless, his gaze unfocused, as though the emptiness in his stomach had hollowed out his spirit. Greta busied herself with Maximilian, dampening a rag with melted snow and pressing it to his burning forehead. His cough shook the barn, dry and sharp, each one pulling Liesel's resolve thinner. She told herself she would go back into the village soon, search again, even if it meant nothing but empty cupboards. But before she could act, the sound returned. Footsteps, clear and deliberate, crunching in the snow outside. This time there was no mistaking it. Not the wind, not an animal. People. The children tensed, their faces pale. Emil scrambled for his broken piece of wood again, while Greta pulled Maximilian closer, shielding him with her body. The barn door creaked, the latch rattled. Liesel's chest tightened. She pushed herself to her feet, stepping between the children and the door. If someone came through, they would face her first. The door swung open. Blinding light poured in from the snow outside, and for a moment, all she saw were dark shapes against the glare. Tall figures in thick coats, helmets catching what little sunlight broke through the clouds. The language that followed was foreign, short commands clipped and unfamiliar. Greta gasped. Emil whispered hoarsely, "Not Germans." The figures stepped forward, and Liesel's heart pounded. She had heard whispers of soldiers in strange uniforms, advancing through villages like ghosts. Some called them liberators, others called them conquerors. She had never expected to see them here, at the edge of their ruined world. One of the men lowered his rifle slightly, his eyes scanning the children with a mixture of caution and surprise. He spoke again, slower this time, though the words still slipped past Liesel's understanding. Another man behind him gave a low whistle, muttering something that sounded like disbelief. Liesel's instinct screamed to push them out, to bar the door and protect what little they had. She raised her chin, standing tall despite the tremor in her knees. "We don't need you," she said in German, her voice sharp, though she knew they might not understand. "Leave us!" The soldiers exchanged glances, their brows furrowing. Then one of them stepped forward. He was younger than the others, his helmet tilted back slightly, revealing brown hair damp with snow. His eyes caught hers, steady, not harsh, not cruel. He spoke haltingly in broken German. "Children. Hungry?" The words struck her like a blow. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Behind her, Maximilian coughed again, a ragged sound that made the young soldier flinch, as though it physically hurt him to hear it. He said something quickly to the others, his voice urgent, then turned back to her. Slowly, carefully, he lowered his rifle all the way and raised his hands in a gesture that seemed universal. No harm. Still, Liesel's chest was tight with suspicion. "Why are you here?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The soldier didn't answer with words this time. Instead, he reached into the satchel at his side and pulled out something small, something steaming against the cold air. The rich, warm scent of broth filled the doorway, drifting through the barn like a memory of a world they had lost. Soup. The children inhaled sharply, their eyes wide, their hunger undeniable. Even Emil dropped his piece of wood, his mouth falling open. Greta's grip on Maximilian loosened as she stared, but Liesel stayed rigid, her heart warring with itself. The strangers had kind eyes, yes, but eyes could lie, and yet the smell of warmth of food was more real than anything she had felt in months. Her voice faltered when she spoke again. What do you want from us?" The soldier met her gaze without hesitation, and though she didn't yet understand his words, his eyes said something simple, something disarming. Nothing. The smell filled the barn, curling through the air with a richness that made every stomach tighten in longing. It was more than soup. It was life simmering in a battered tin cup. The young soldier crouched down, steam rising between him and the children, his hands steady as he held it out. No one moved. The children stared, caught between hunger and fear. Greta's fingers tightened on Maximilian's blanket, her lips pressed to his temple as though shielding him with sheer will. Emil swallowed audibly, his eyes locked on the rising steam. Liesel's jaw clenched. "Why?" she demanded in German, her voice sharp. "Why give us this?" The soldier tilted his head, as though listening harder than she expected. His German was broken, rough, but he managed, "Because you need." His accent bent the words, but the meaning was clear. Her throat burned with mistrust. Nothing came without a cost. She remembered neighbors whispering about men who promised food and instead dragged people away. Kindness was a currency she could no longer believe in. But then Maximilian coughed again, a harsh, rattling sound that shook his thin frame. The boy whimpered softly, burying his face against Greta's shoulder. The soldier's eyes flicked to him, and something changed in his expression. He slowly set the cup on the floorboards, pushing it gently across the hay toward them. Then, without a word, he pulled a thick wool blanket from his pack and unfolded it, holding it out. The blanket was clean, heavy, impossibly warm-looking. Greta's eyes widened, her grip loosening just slightly. "Liesel," she whispered. "No," Liesel said quickly. though her own resolve wavered. "We don't know what they want." The soldier lowered the blanket onto the ground beside the cup and stepped back, palms raised again, in the same gesture as before. No harm. His companions watched from the doorway, their rifles lowered but still close at hand, their expressions unreadable. Emil shifted uneasily. "It's food, Liesel," he muttered. "And he's freezing." His gaze flicked toward Maximilian. "We can't just sit here and watch him." "Quiet," Liesel snapped, but her voice trembled. The smell of the soup was unbearable now. It reached into the hollow of her stomach, twisting painfully, reminding her that she hadn't eaten properly in days. She glanced at the boy in Greta's arms. Maximilian's lips were pale, his small body shivering under rags that did nothing against the frost. The soldier knelt again, meeting her eyes with patience that unnerved her. Slowly, he touched his chest. "Jack," he said, tapping once, as if offering his name as proof of his humanity. Then he pointed gently at the cup, then at Maximilian. "For him!" The barn was still, every breath caught in the space between choice and survival. Greta's whisper broke it. "Please, Liesel, just this once. For Max." Liesel's heart battled itself. Every instinct screamed caution, but the sight of the boy's trembling frame crushed her resistance. With a slow, deliberate step, she approached the cup. The soldier stayed still, his eyes never leaving hers. His body coiled but not threatening. She crouched, her hand trembling as she lifted the tin. The warmth seeped into her fingers instantly, foreign and intoxicating. She hesitated only a moment longer before bringing it to Maximilian's lips. Greta helped him sip, carefully tilting his head. The boy swallowed weakly, then coughed, but the steam flushed his face with a trace of color that hadn't been there minutes before. The other children leaned closer, their eyes wide, not with fear now, but with yearning. Liesel returned the cup, her gaze locked on Jack. "If this hurts him," she began, but the words faltered. Jack shook his head. His voice was low, almost gentle. "No hurt." "Help!" The word clung to her, fragile yet heavy with possibility. Help! For the first time in months, warmth spread through the barn, not just from the soup or the blanket, but from something far more dangerous. Hope. The soup was gone, every drop swallowed by the children with desperate gratitude. But the warmth lingered in their bodies like an ember fighting the frost. Maximilian had drifted into a lighter sleep, his breathing still rough but less frantic. The blanket lay over him, heavy and real, more security than any of them had known in months. The soldiers remained near the doorway, careful not to crowd the children. Their voices were low, their strange language rising and falling like a river against stones. Yet Jack stayed closer, crouched by the hay as if determined not to appear as a threat. His eyes, watchful and soft, followed every movement inside the barn. Liesel sat opposite him, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Suspicion still hardened her features. She studied him with the same intensity he studied her, unwilling to let the fragile thread of trust grow unchecked. Finally, she asked in German, "Why are you here? This village has nothing." Jack tilted his head, catching enough to answer. His German was clumsy, his accent heavy, but his effort was undeniable. "War. Move. Soldiers. Move." He gestured eastward, then back at himself. Here now." Liesel frowned. His words were broken, but clear enough. They were passing through. He could leave tomorrow, or never return at all. Greta, still seated beside Maximilian, looked up. "If they're moving, they'll take the food with them. We'll be left with nothing again." Her voice trembled with both anger and fear. Jack's gaze shifted to her, then back to Liesel. He hesitated, as though choosing between silence and confession. At last, he tapped his chest again. "Jack." "I remember," Liesel said stiffly. He drew a breath, searching for words. His German failed him, so he resorted to fragments, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Brother. Small. Pearl Harbor." His eyes darkened. "Gone." The barn was silent. The name meant nothing to the children, but the grief in his tone needed no translation. Liesel felt her throat tighten. She recognized that look, the look of someone who had lost a piece of themselves that could never be returned. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Emil broke the silence, his curiosity slipping past fear. "Was he younger than you?" Jack's face softened at the boy's attempt. He nodded. "Yes, younger." He lowered his eyes briefly, as if seeing another time, another place. He liked to laugh. Liesel's heart ached. She thought of her mother's lullaby, of hands braiding her hair, of the warmth that had vanished in a single night. She didn't want to share, but the words pushed through the cracks in her walls. "My mother sang," she whispered. The German words felt heavy on her tongue, but she didn't stop. "She sang the night our house burned." "I still hear it." Greta looked at her sharply, startled by the admission, but Jack's gaze held steady. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate gesture that carried understanding deeper than language. For the first time, Liesel didn't feel as though she was speaking to a soldier. She was speaking to someone who carried loss like she did, but the fragile moment was pierced by reality. Another soldier called something from the doorway, his voice clipped, authoritative. Jack glanced back, his expression tightening. He answered quickly, then returned his focus to the children. His face told her enough. "Orders." "What did he say?" Liesel demanded. Jack hesitated, then struggled with the words. "Children. Move. Center. Refugee." He gestured with his hand, sweeping outward, then tapped his chest. "Safe. Food." Greta's body stiffened instantly. "No," she said sharply, her voice trembling. "We won't leave. This is our home." Liesel's heart pounded. For the first time since the soldiers arrived, fear returned, not of rifles or boots, but of what leaving might mean. Jack's eyes pleaded with her, his voice quiet but firm. "Better. Safe." The word echoed inside her, colliding with doubt. Safety had never come without cost. And now, faced with the possibility of losing the only place that still tied them to memory, she didn't know if she could trust him or herself. The barn seemed smaller after Jack's words, the air pressing down with a heaviness that had nothing to do with cold. Greta rose from her place beside Maximilian, her eyes blazing. She pointed toward the door where the soldiers waited. "No," she said fiercely in German, her voice sharper than it had been in months. "We are not going anywhere with them. This is our home." The younger children shrank back at her sudden intensity, but she didn't falter. She turned on Liesel, her frustration spilling out. "Don't you see? They want to take us away, to some place we don't know. We'll be nothing there, just more mouths in a camp. At least here we belong." Liesel's throat tightened. "Here," she whispered, her voice cutting against Greta's anger. "Here where the cupboards are empty? Where Max is sick and freezing? What do we belong to, ashes and ruins?" Greta's jaw clenched, but her eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "It's still ours," she insisted. "If we leave, we're giving up everything our parents died for." The words struck hard, hitting places in Liesel's heart she fought to keep buried. She saw the others watching, Emil fidgeting with his hands, the smaller children pressed together like frightened birds. She couldn't let Greta's fire ignite panic. Jack shifted uneasily, as if sensing the storm he couldn't fully understand. He stepped forward slightly, but Liesel raised a hand to stop him. This wasn't his fight. Not yet. Emil broke the silence with his tentative voice. "What if she's right, Liesel? What if they take us somewhere far? What if we can't come back?" Liesel turned to him, her face tight with the weight of too many choices for someone her age. "And what if staying means we don't survive the winter?" Her words lingered like frost in the barn. Greta shook her head, her voice trembling but unyielding. "I would rather die here than be dragged like cattle to their camps. Haven't we lost enough already? Do you want to lose who we are too?" The question cut deep. Liesel remembered her mother's voice, her father's laughter before the war tore everything apart. Were they really still here, tied to these crumbling walls, or only in her memory? Jack, sensing the fragile moment, tried again. "Safe," he said, pointing to the east. His German stumbled, but his tone was steady. "Food warm, not camp." He searched for the words, then pressed his hand against his chest. "Promise." Greta let out a bitter laugh, sharp and hollow. "Promises?" She turned on him with words he likely couldn't understand, but her fury needed no translation. "Your kind made promises before, and they burned this village to the ground. Why should we believe you now?" Jack's eyes softened. He didn't defend himself, didn't raise his voice. He only stood there, the weight of her accusations settling into the silence. Liesl saw it all. The pain in Greta's defiance, the patience in Jack's eyes, the hunger etched into every face around her. She felt torn in two, pulled between the roots of the past and the fragile branches of a future she could barely imagine. Greta stepped closer, her voice dropping low, meant only for Liesl. "Don't let them take us. If you care about this family, if you care about me, you'll say no." Liesl stared at her, words caught in her throat. She wanted to protect them all, to honor the memories Greta clung to, but she also wanted to save them from a death that waited patiently in the frost. Before she could answer, Maximilian stirred, his cough tearing through the barn again. His small body shook violently, and the sound broke whatever wall Liesl had been building inside herself. She pressed her hand to his chest, feeling the weakness of his breath. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but unshakable. "I don't know what's right, but I know we can't keep going like this." Greta turned away, her shoulders trembling, her silence louder than any scream. The barn was filled with two truths, colliding like storm winds, the desperate need to survive and the aching need to belong. And between them, Liesl stood, knowing she would have to choose soon, whether she wanted to or not. The decision was not made in words, but in actions. The next morning, the Americans returned with supplies. Not rifles, not threats, supplies. Blankets folded over their arms, cans of food stacked in crates, tools clanking at their belts. The sound was unfamiliar, not the chaos of war, but the order of building. The barn, once only a shelter against wind, began to transform. Soldiers cleared debris, laying fresh straw in place of the damp old piles. They set up a small iron stove in the corner, coaxing fire from coal until the barn filled with a warmth that seemed almost unreal. For the first time in weeks, the children stretched their hands toward heat that didn't come from their own breath. Liesl stood back, watching with wary eyes. She couldn't quite believe what she saw. The men moved with quiet efficiency, speaking in that strange rolling language she didn't understand, but their gestures carried no cruelty. When Jack placed a tin of canned meat in her hands, she nearly dropped it. The weight felt impossible. So much food at once. Emil tore it open with clumsy eagerness, his face alight as though he had forgotten how to smile. Greta didn't smile, but she didn't stop him either. She sat near Maximilian, who ate carefully from a spoon Jack had provided, color slowly returning to his cheeks. "This won't last," Greta muttered in German, her tone bitter. "When they leave, they'll take it all." "Then we'll use it while we can," Liesl replied firmly, "and maybe we'll learn how to manage without them after." Greta said nothing, but her silence was softer than before. By afternoon, more changes came. The soldiers carried in planks and nails, repairing gaps in the walls, patching holes in the roof. One of them even fixed the broken latch on the barn door. The sound of hammering filled the air, rhythmic and purposeful, like the heartbeat of life returning to the village. From the forest edge, other eyes watched. Slowly, cautiously, villagers who had hidden away during the worst days began to emerge. A gaunt woman wrapped in a shawl, two older men leaning on canes, even a boy not much older than Emil. They lingered at a distance at first, uncertain. Liesl noticed them before the soldiers did. Her chest tightened at the sight. For so long, she had believed she and the children were the last, the only ones left clinging to survival. Now she saw proof that others had endured. Jack caught her gaze, then looked toward the newcomers. He didn't chase them away. Instead, he gestured openly, offering the same simple invitation he had given her. No harm. The villagers approached in hesitant steps, eyes wary but drawn by the sight of warmth and the smell of food. One of the American soldiers, older and broad-shouldered, handed a loaf of bread to the shawled woman. She held it to her chest, tears filling her eyes, as though the weight of the bread itself broke something inside her. The barn was no longer just shelter. It was becoming a gathering place, a hearth for people who had forgotten what community felt like. That evening, Liesl helped organize the food. She portioned out the bread, counted the tins, and arranged the blankets so the smallest children were covered first. The others followed her lead without question. Even Greta, though still reluctant, obeyed her instructions. For the first time, they weren't simply surviving. They were working together, building something that felt almost like order. Jack watched quietly from the corner, his hands resting on his knees. His eyes lingered on Liesl as she moved among the children, checking on each one. She noticed, but she didn't look back for long. Leadership wasn't about being seen, it was about carrying the weight no one else could. When night fell, the barn was warm, the air alive with the soft murmur of voices. The silence that had once been suffocating was now replaced with something new, belonging. And though the war still raged beyond the horizon, here in this small corner of ruins, life had begun to stir again. The barn glowed with firelight, warmth radiating from the iron stove that had become the center of their fragile world. Bread was passed hand to hand, soup ladled from battered pots, blankets shared. For the first time in months, the children drifted to sleep without fear gnawing at their stomachs. Yet not everyone welcomed the change. Frau Anneliese arrived at dusk, her figure rigid as she stepped into the barn. The widow carried herself with the sharp dignity of someone who had lost everything yet refused to bend. Her grey hair was pulled back tightly, her lips pressed thin. She surveyed the scene, the children wrapped in foreign blankets, villagers sitting shoulder to shoulder with soldiers, and her eyes narrowed. "So this is what we've become," she said in German, her voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of voices. "Dependent. Beggars in our own land." The room quieted. Some villagers looked down, ashamed, while others pretended not to hear. The children froze, their comfort punctured by the weight of her scorn. Liesl rose slowly. She could feel Jack's gaze on her, but this wasn't his fight. It was theirs. "We didn't ask for this," Liesl said, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "But we need it. Max needs it." She gestured toward the boy, sleeping under the blanket Jack had given. Frau Anneliese's eyes hardened. "And what will you do when they leave, when they take their charity with them? Will you still know how to stand, or will you crawl at the feet of the next army that passes?" Greta stirred, her face tense, but Liesl stepped forward before she could speak. The memory of frost-bitten nights pressed against her words, giving them strength. "We survived alone," Liesl said firmly. "We know how to suffer. But suffering is not dignity. Feeding the hungry, keeping children alive, there is no shame in that." The widow scoffed, her chin lifting. "You speak as though you understand honor, child." Liesl's chest tightened, but she didn't waver. "Honor is not letting children die when help is offered. Honor is protecting them, no matter who brings the bread." The silence stretched. The villagers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the girl and the widow. Jack remained still, watching, his expression unreadable, though something like respect flickered in his eyes. At last, Frau Anneliese's shoulders sagged, just slightly. Her face softened, though her pride kept her words sharp. "You are young, too young to carry such weight." "Maybe," Liesl replied quietly. "But someone must." The old woman looked at her a moment longer, then turned and walked out, her shawl trailing behind her. The barn exhaled with relief. Emil grinned faintly, breaking the tension. "You sounded like a general, Liesl." She shook her head, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "I sounded like someone tired of being cold." The children laughed softly, the sound fragile but real. Greta even allowed herself a smile, though her eyes lingered on Liesl with something deeper than amusement, something like respect. Later, as the fire burned low, Jack approached her. His German was clumsy, but his meaning was clear. "Strong," he said, tapping his chest, then nodding toward her. "Leader." The word struck her like an echo she hadn't expected. Leader. She wasn't sure she deserved it, but when she looked at the children, at Greta, At Maximilian sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, she realized the truth. She had been leading all along. The night ended, not with silence, but with the murmur of voices, the crackle of fire, the fragile rhythm of life finding its way back into broken hearts. And though war still loomed just beyond the horizon, inside the barn, dignity had taken root in something stronger than pride: compassion. The next morning dawned with a strange kind of quiet, not the oppressive silence of hunger and fear, but the gentle hush of a village stirring awake. The barn smelled of bread crusts and smoke, a fragrance that no longer carried only desperation, but possibility. Outside, the snow was beginning to soften under the weak kiss of early spring, patches of earth showing through like promises. The Americans returned with something unexpected: a small slate chalkboard, several sticks of chalk, and a bundle of worn books, their covers faded and spines cracked from years of use. One of the soldiers set them down carefully on a wooden crate, smiling in his awkward way, as though he knew how out of place they looked among rifles and rations. The children crowded closer, eyes wide. Emil reached for the chalk instantly, his fingers dusted white as he scrawled uneven lines across the slate. Greta tried to snatch it back. "It's not a toy, Emil," she scolded. But her voice carried more life than it had in weeks, and even Emil's grin felt lighter than before. Jack crouched nearby, gesturing toward the books. "School," he said slowly, the word rough but recognizable. He pointed to his head, then to the children. "Learn." The children exchanged glances, uncertain. For so long, survival had been their only lesson. Yet curiosity stirred among them, a spark that hunger and frost had not managed to extinguish. Liesel stepped forward. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched the spine of one book, opening it with reverence. The pages smelled of dust and history. Letters sprawled across them, German words she remembered tracing under her mother's patient hand. Her chest ached, but not with grief this time. With longing. Greta watched her carefully. "Do you remember enough to teach them?" she asked in a low voice. Liesel hesitated. "Maybe." She glanced at Maximilian, who sat propped against the blanket, his face still pale, but eyes brighter than days before. He was staring at the chalkboard as if it were a window to another world. She cleared her throat. "Then yes. I'll try." The children gathered around as Liesel lifted the chalk. Her first strokes were clumsy, the white lines breaking against the slate. But soon letters began to form: A, B, C. She spoke each one aloud in German, her voice growing stronger with every sound. "Say it with me," she told them. Their voices rose hesitant at first, then more confident, filling the barn with echoes of something long lost. Emil stumbled over the shapes, Greta corrected him sharply, and even one of the smaller children, Ingrid, with hair like tangled straw, giggled as she repeated the letters. Jack watched in silence, his face soft, almost wistful. He didn't need to understand the words to recognize the power in them. When Liesel turned to Maximilian, she crouched beside him, writing a simple word: brought. She held the slate before him. "Can you read this?" His lips moved slowly, forming the word. Brought. His voice was weak, but it carried triumph. The barn erupted in small cheers, Emil clapping him on the back, Greta smiling despite herself. Maximilian beamed faintly, a spark of pride shining through his exhaustion. Liesel felt warmth rise in her chest, stronger than the stove's heat. For the first time, she wasn't just keeping them alive, she was giving them something to reach for. That night, when the fire dimmed and the others drifted to sleep, Liesel sat with the book in her lap, tracing the letters by lantern light. Jack lingered nearby, watching. "You teach," he said softly in halting German. She nodded. "They need more than food." His eyes lingered on her, and though he said nothing more, she sensed the weight of his thoughts. Perhaps he saw in her what he had once seen in his brother, a spark of life too stubborn to be extinguished by war. The barn no longer felt like a grave of memories. It felt like a place where beginnings were possible again. The days that followed felt almost unreal. The barn, once a tomb of silence, pulsed with life again. Laughter returned in small bursts, hesitant, fragile, but real. Bread was shared, lessons were learned. Warmth filled the space that had once known only frost. Liesel allowed herself to believe, if only for a moment, that survival had shifted into something more. But peace never lingered long in wartime. Jack entered the barn one evening with a look that froze Liesel's stomach before he spoke a word. His usual calm eyes were shadowed, his movements heavier than before. He crouched low, speaking slowly in his broken German. "Orders. We leave." 2 days. The words fell like stones into water, ripples spreading instantly through the barn. Emil sat up sharply. "Leave? What do you mean, leave?" Jack's gaze shifted, his jaw tightening. "Unit, move east. Tomorrow, after." He gestured with his hand, sweeping forward. "All soldiers. Must." Greta rose, her face pale. "You can't." "You can't just go." Maximilian stirred at her tone, coughing, his fragile body trembling. Greta pulled him close, her anger spilling out like fire. "You bring food, warmth, hope. And now you say you're leaving. What happens to us when you're gone?" Jack lowered his head, his silence louder than any reply. Liesel's throat felt tight, her chest aching. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "And us? Do we go to this refugee place you spoke of, or do we stay here with nothing?" He hesitated, searching for words. "Safe, food, but not here." He gestured again, pointing toward the east. Greta's voice cracked. "No, we're not cattle to be herded. This is our home." She looked at Liesel, her eyes desperate. Tell him we're not leaving with strangers." Liesel stood frozen. Her mind raced with memories of starvation, of nights listening to Maximilian's fevered breaths, of the frost clawing at her bones. The barn was safe now only because of these men. Without them, would it crumble back into despair? Emil broke the silence with a voice thin with fear. "If they leave, we'll die. You know we will." Greta turned on him sharply. "Better to die here than be dragged who knows where." "Enough!" Liesel snapped, her voice cracking under the weight of it all. Both of them fell silent, their eyes on her. She turned back to Jack. "Do we have a choice?" He looked at her long, his expression torn between duty and something more human. "Choice hard." His voice dropped lower. "But I want you safe." The words struck deep, heavier than the foreign syllables they were wrapped in. She wanted to believe him, but belief was a dangerous thing. That night the barn didn't feel warm anymore. The fire still burned, blankets still covered the children, but the air was thick with fear and uncertainty. The villagers who had returned whispered in corners, their voices laced with suspicion. Some spoke of leaving with the soldiers, others of hiding again. Liesel sat awake long after the others had drifted into uneasy sleep. She held the cracked book in her lap, but couldn't read a word. Her thoughts circled endlessly, torn between Greta's fierce resistance and Emil's trembling plea. Between memory and survival. Jack lingered near the doorway, his silhouette outlined by firelight. He didn't speak, but when his eyes met hers, she saw the same conflict mirrored there. Duty pulled him one way, compassion the other. The night stretched on, and though dawn was hours away, Liesel felt as though the choice was already upon her. Soon, she would have to decide if she trusted the strangers who had given them warmth, or if she would cling to the ruins, even if it meant being swallowed by the frost once more. The day of departure arrived with a silence heavier than snow. The soldiers packed their gear methodically, boots crunching against the frosted ground, rifles slung across their shoulders. The barn no longer echoed with laughter or lessons. It felt like a place waiting to be emptied. The children clung to one another, their faces pale with the knowledge that everything could unravel again. Emil kicked at the straw, muttering curses under his breath, though his trembling voice betrayed his fear. Greta sat stiffly beside Maximilian, who leaned against her shoulder, too weak to protest but awake enough to sense what was happening. Jack entered quietly, his helmet tucked under his arm. His eyes found Liesel instantly. She stood apart from the others, arms crossed, her chin raised in the same defiance she had shown the first night they met. but her heart pounded, her breath tight. He crouched down to her level, speaking softly in broken German. "We go now." Her throat tightened. "And us?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the children behind her. Then he reached into his pack, pulling out a small object wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a brass compass, its glass scratched but intact. He pressed it into her palm, closing her fingers around it. "My brother's," he said simply. His voice faltered for the first time. "Now, yours." Liesel stared at the compass, the needle trembling as though it shared her unease. Her eyes burned, but she forced the tears back. "Why give this to me?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Because you lead. They follow you." He nodded toward the children. "You strong." Like him. The words sank deep, heavier than the gift itself. She wanted to argue, to insist she wasn't strong, that she was just a girl holding broken promises together with trembling hands. But when she looked back at the children, their trust, their fear, their fragile hope, she knew Jack spoke truth. Greta stood abruptly, her voice sharp. "So this is it? You leave us with scraps and trinkets, then march away to your war?" Jack didn't flinch. He met her anger with steady eyes. "I wish stay. But duty." He pressed his hand to his chest, then extended it outward as if trying to give her something invisible. "Heart with you." Greta turned away, biting her lip, her shoulders shaking. Liesel knew her anger was only the mask for grief she couldn't show. Emil stepped forward, his voice breaking. "Will you come back?" Jack's silence was answer enough. He knelt, ruffling the boy's hair gently, then rose, his gaze returning to Liesel one final time. "Keep them safe," he said. The words were halting, but clear. Liesel clutched the compass so tightly the edges dug into her palm. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to beg him not to go. Instead, she nodded once, the weight of responsibility settling onto her like a mantle. The soldiers gathered their things, leaving behind what they could: blankets folded neatly, bread placed in baskets, a pot of soup simmering one last time, quiet gifts offered without ceremony. When the final orders came, they filed out into the snow, their boots leaving sharp prints that stretched toward the horizon. Jack lingered at the edge of the barn, his eyes locked with Liesel's. No words were spoken, none were needed. Then he turned, following his unit east, his figure swallowed by distance until only the memory of his kindness remained. Inside the barn, silence reigned. Greta sat with her arms around Maximilian. Emil stared at the door as though willing Jack to return, and the smaller children huddled together in uncertainty. Liesel stood alone, the compass warm in her hand, its needle pointing steadily north. She slipped it into her pocket, her chest heavy with both loss and determination. The war had taken much from them, and now it had taken Jack too. But his gift was clear: direction. And whether it led them to survival or to ruin, Liesel would carry it forward. The days after Jack's departure were heavy, like the still air before a storm. The barn remained warm, but something had changed in the space between them. The laughter had quieted, the chatter muted. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something they couldn't name. Liesel moved among the children, her actions mechanical at first, feeding them, tucking them in, making sure Maximilian's fever didn't return. But there was no hiding the weight in her chest, the endless thoughts of the soldiers leaving and the future they now faced alone. She found herself staring out the barn door more often, watching the shifting snow, willing some answer to appear. One morning, as the sun shone weakly through the cracks in the roof, something shifted in the air. The snow, which had clung to the ground in stubborn layers, began to soften. The wind, once biting and cruel, now carried the faintest trace of warmth. It was as if the world, frozen for so long, had finally begun to stir. Liesel knelt beside the children as they began to stir, her fingers brushing over the pages of one of the old books they'd been using to teach themselves. Maximilian looked up at her with clear, tired eyes. "Is it spring?" he asked, his voice raspy but full of curiosity. She smiled at him, though the weight of the question threatened to choke her. "Maybe," she answered softly. "Maybe it is." The days that followed were slow, the way spring always arrived after a long winter, unnoticed at first, then suddenly everywhere. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of brown earth where wildflowers had slept beneath the frost. Birds returned, their songs strange and hopeful, though they still felt like a distant memory. Greta helped Liesel clean the barn, though her heart didn't seem in it. There was still resistance in her eyes, a lingering distrust of the world outside, but it was softer now, less rigid. She carried the weight of her grief with her, but there was something else in her too, something fragile, like the first green shoots of new life. One afternoon, Emile and the smaller children ventured into the woods, returning with armfuls of twigs, branches, and a few handfuls of wild mushrooms. It was a meager haul, but it was a victory. It was something. When they brought it into the barn, Liesel felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months: hope. The children worked together, cleaning the mushrooms, gathering what firewood they could find. As they worked, they spoke more freely, their voices lighter, as if the act of doing something together, something that felt almost normal, was enough to push the shadows back. By the evening, they had a small fire crackling in the corner of the barn. The soup that Liesel had prepared was thin, but it was enough to fill their stomachs. For the first time in weeks, they ate without the gnawing fear of starvation, the taste of food not just satisfying hunger, but bringing a sense of shared purpose. Liesel sat back, watching them. The firelight flickered in their eyes, casting long shadows across their faces, but there was something else there too. She saw Emile laughing with Ingrid, Greta smiling as she tucked the children into the corner with their blankets. Maximilian's eyes were brighter than they had been in days. For a moment, the barn was a home again. Liesel closed her eyes, just for a moment, letting herself feel the warmth that surrounded them, the warmth they had built together. She didn't know what the future would hold, but in that moment it didn't matter. Spring had begun, and even if the world outside was still fractured, they had found something, small and fragile, but real, something to hold on to. The days had slipped into weeks, each one carrying with it the weight of survival, but also the flicker of something more. Life in the barn had become a strange mix of ordinary and extraordinary. They no longer measured time by hunger or cold, but by the little victories: Maximilian's cough subsiding, the children laughing, the land outside finally waking up after the long winter. But still, the world beyond the barn remained a question, one they could never fully answer. The war had never truly gone away. There were soldiers still, rumors of fighting in the east, whispers of more soldiers, Americans, Germans who knew, coming through the town. Liesel didn't dare imagine what that would bring. One morning, as the children helped collect firewood from the small woodshed, a figure appeared on the horizon, walking through the misty light of dawn. Liesel stood frozen at the barn door, her breath catching. It wasn't the soldiers. This was different. The figure was a woman, her movements hesitant, uncertain. Greta stepped up beside Liesel, her hand on her arm. "Who is it?" "I don't know," Liesel whispered. The woman came closer, and Liesel's heart skipped. She recognized the figure, though she had only seen her from a distance once or twice. It was Frau Anneliese. The widow approached the barn with slow steps, her face drawn tight, her hands clutching a bundle of cloth to her chest. Liesel stepped forward, her heart pounding. Frau Anneliese stopped at the edge of the barn, looking at the group of children gathered inside. Her gaze swept over them, lingering briefly on Liesel before turning to the others. Frau Anneliese began, her voice thick with something that was neither anger nor sadness. "I heard you were still here. I heard there were food, warmth." Her eyes flicked to the fire. I've come to ask for help." Liesel's breath hitched. It was impossible to imagine. Frau Anneliese, who had once stood so firm, so proud, now seeking help. "What happened?" Greta asked sharply, stepping forward. You left us to die, and now you want help." Frau Anneliese's shoulders slumped at the words, but she didn't argue. I've lost everything. The others who stayed, they're gone. My house was burned. I couldn't stay there any longer. She swallowed hard, her voice faltering. I thought you would hate me. But She took a slow, shaky breath. I need help. I don't know where else to go. There was a long silence, the air heavy with tension. The children watched, some uncertain, others more open. They had learned in these weeks to be cautious with who they trusted. But they had also learned that kindness was a thing worth giving, even when it wasn't deserved. Liesl looked at the widow, the woman who had once criticized her and the others for taking refuge in this very barn. There was no anger left in her. There was only the raw, unspoken truth of what the war had taken. Finally, Liesl stepped forward, her voice steady but soft. We can help you, she said simply. But you must understand. We are not strong because of what we have. We are strong because we help each other. Frau Anneliese nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. She lowered her head, a silent acknowledgement of what she had lost. Maximilian walked over, still weak but curious. He tugged at Liesl's sleeve, his voice small. Will she stay with us? Liesl nodded, her eyes meeting Greta's. For the first time in weeks, Greta smiled, though the smile was hesitant, uncertain, but it was a beginning. Frau Anneliese sat quietly by the fire, her hand still clutching the bundle of cloth. Liesl offered her some bread, and she took it with a quiet thanks. The gesture, small as it was, holding more weight than any of them could explain. As the day drew to a close, the barn once again filled with the sounds of children playing, of voices speaking in quiet conversations. The space felt more full, more alive, as though the very act of sharing could bring the dead back to life. Liesl stood by the door, watching the sun set through the trees. The horizon was still fractured by war, still uncertain. But within this barn, within these walls, something had changed. They had once been the children who hid, the children who ran, who starved, who cried in the silence. But now, they were something more. They were the children who helped, the children who learned to survive, not just by living but by sharing, and in that they had found something that no war could take.